You grow up believing family is the one place where nothing can hurt you. But what if that's exactly where you were first studied, first understood, and first learned to be controlled? What if the people who know your smile the best also know the exact pressure points behind it? The memories you avoid, the emotions you hide, the words that make you pause before you even think? And the most unsettling part is this: it doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like conversation, concern, or even care. But once you start noticing the pattern, you can never unsee it again. Within every family, there is a kind of observation that doesn't feel like observation at all. It doesn't come with cameras or questions that feel invasive. Instead, it happens slowly over years of shared rooms, shared meals, shared silence, and shared memories. People often assume that the people closest to them understand them in the most comforting way, but sometimes understanding goes deeper than comfort. It becomes awareness. And awareness in the wrong hands or even in unintentional moments can turn into something powerful. From childhood, you are not just growing in front of your family. You are being quietly studied by them. They notice how you react when you are praised, how your voice changes when you are upset, how your silence behaves when you feel hurt. They learn your patterns before you even realize you have patterns. The way you avoid conflict, the way you over-explain yourself when you feel guilty, or the way your eyes shift when a certain memory is touched. These things are rarely invisible to people who have watched you for years. And over time, this silent understanding becomes a kind of emotional map of who you are. What makes this even more complex is that most of this observation is not intentional in a harmful sense. It often begins with care. Family members learn each other so they can respond better, love better, and support better. But human nature is complicated. The same knowledge that builds connection can also become a point of influence. When someone knows what affects you deeply, they don't need to force anything. Sometimes, even a small sentence, a reminder, or a tone of voice is enough to shift your emotional state. This is where the line between care and control becomes blurred. In many families, people don't even realize when they are using emotional knowledge as leverage during arguments or moments of frustration. A memory from the past is brought up. A weakness is mentioned in passing. A sensitive topic is touched without awareness of its impact. And while it may not always come from a place of intention, the effect is still real. It shapes how you respond, how you defend yourself, and sometimes even how you see yourself. Over time, this creates an invisible dynamic where you start to feel known in a way that is both comforting and unsettling. You are understood, but you are also predictable. And when someone can predict your emotional response, they can unintentionally influence the direction of a conversation, a disagreement, or even your sense of confidence. It doesn't always feel like pressure from the outside. It often feels like pressure from within because it is tied to emotions you cannot easily separate from your identity. But recognizing this pattern is not about creating distance or distrust. It is about awareness, because awareness changes everything. When you begin to see that your emotional responses are not random and that certain reactions are being shaped by familiarity rather than truth, you start to regain control over your inner world. You begin to understand that just because someone knows your weakness does not mean they define your strength. And in that realization, something powerful happens. You stop reacting blindly and start responding consciously. You begin to separate your emotions from the influence of repetition. You understand that knowledge of your vulnerability is not the same as ownership of it. And slowly, you reclaim the space inside yourself that was never meant to be controlled by anyone else. Within the closest circle of family, trust is not something you build once. It is something that grows naturally, without effort, through everyday life. You assume that because someone has seen you at your most vulnerable, they will handle your emotions with care. But trust has a quiet side effect. It lowers your defense without you even noticing. The more familiar the people around you become, the less you feel the need to protect your inner world. And that is where emotional exposure begins, not as a decision, but as a habit. In family dynamics, familiarity often replaces boundaries. You speak more freely, you react more honestly, and you express emotions you would normally hide from the outside world. This openness feels natural, even healthy, but over time, it creates a situation where your emotional responses become visible to others in a very precise way. People begin to understand not just what you say, but how you feel before you say it. They recognize the pause before your answer, the shift in your tone when something touches a sensitive memory, and the way your expression changes when a certain topic appears. This level of understanding can feel like deep connection, and in many ways, it is. But connection is not always neutral. When someone knows how you respond emotionally, they also know how to influence that response, sometimes without even realizing it. A small reminder of the past can bring back emotions you thought were buried. A simple sentence can reopen an old wound. Even silence, when used at the wrong moment, can create discomfort that feels heavier than words. What makes this dynamic even more complex is that it rarely appears as intentional control. Most of the time, it is woven into normal conversations, disagreements, or emotional reactions. A family member might bring up something from the past during an argument without realizing how deeply it affects you, or they might use your emotional sensitivity as a way to make a point, not fully understanding the weight behind it. Over time, these small moments build a pattern, and that pattern begins to shape how you see yourself in relation to others. You may start noticing that certain conversations always lead to the same emotional reaction in you. You might feel yourself becoming defensive before you even fully understand why, or you may notice that certain topics make you withdraw completely, not because you choose to, but because your emotional system has learned to protect itself automatically. This is how influence begins to form, not through force, but through repetition and familiarity. The most challenging part is that because it comes from family, you often question your own reactions instead of questioning the pattern. You wonder if you are overthinking, overreacting, or being too sensitive. This internal doubt becomes part of the cycle. Instead of stepping back and observing the dynamic, you begin adjusting yourself to avoid discomfort, slowly shaping your behavior around emotional triggers that were never truly yours to carry. But awareness interrupts this cycle. When you begin to recognize that your emotional responses have been shaped by repeated exposure rather than pure intention, you regain a sense of clarity. You start to see that not every reaction you have needs to define you, and not every emotional trigger deserves control over your decisions. You learn to pause between feeling and responding, and in that pause, something important changes. You are no longer just reacting to what is said or done. You are observing it. And observation creates space. That space is where boundaries are rebuilt, where emotional independence begins, and where you slowly separate your identity from the influence of unchecked familiarity. Every person carries certain emotional pressure points, specific memories, words, or experiences that reach deeper than ordinary conversation. These are not always obvious on the surface. Sometimes they are hidden behind calm expressions, quiet behavior, or even a strong personality. But within a family, these pressure points rarely stay hidden forever. Over time, they are discovered not through investigation, but through repeated exposure to your reactions. It might begin with something small. A certain topic is mentioned, and your tone shifts slightly. A joke is made, and your smile fades just a little too quickly. A memory is brought up and you go unusually silent. These moments may seem insignificant to you, but to someone who has known you for years, they are noticed. And once something is noticed more than once, it becomes remembered. Gradually, people begin to understand which parts of your past or personality carry more emotional weight than others. What makes these pressure points powerful is not just that they exist, but that they are predictable. When someone knows that a specific word, situation, or memory will trigger a reaction in you, it creates a quiet form of influence. They don't need to raise their voice or force a situation. Simply bringing up the right topic at the right moment can shift your entire emotional state. It can make you defensive, emotional, withdrawn, or even unsure of yourself, all without any visible pressure being applied. In many cases, this is not done with harmful intent. People often bring up sensitive topics during arguments or discussions without fully understanding the impact. They may think they are just expressing frustration or making a point, but the effect is deeper than that. When an emotional pressure point is touched, it doesn't just affect the current moment, it reactivates past feelings that were never fully resolved. This is why the reaction often feels stronger than the situation itself. Over time, repeated exposure to these triggers can shape your behavior in subtle ways. You might start avoiding certain conversations altogether. You may choose silence instead of expression, not because you have nothing to say, but because you want to protect yourself from that familiar emotional discomfort. In some cases, you might even begin to question your own feelings, wondering why certain things affect you so deeply without realizing that the pattern has been reinforced again and again. This creates an internal conflict. On one hand, you want to be understood by your family. On the other hand, you begin to feel exposed in a way that is difficult to explain. You are not just reacting to the present, you are reacting to the memory of how similar moments have felt before. And because these experiences are tied to people you trust, the confusion becomes even more intense. You don't always know whether to defend yourself, explain yourself, or simply stay quiet. But recognizing these pressure points is where change begins. When you become aware of what triggers you, you start to separate the trigger from your identity. You begin to understand that your reaction is not a weakness, it is a signal that something within you needs attention, not repetition. This awareness allows you to pause before reacting, to observe what is happening internally instead of being carried away by it. And in that moment of awareness, control slowly returns to you. The same words, the same topics, the same situations may still appear, but they no longer hold the same power, because once you understand your own emotional landscape, no one else can navigate it without your permission. There is a moment in every repeated experience where it stops feeling like coincidence and starts becoming a pattern. In family dynamics, this shift is often so subtle that you don't recognize it at first. You simply notice that certain conversations always seem to end the same way. The same emotions rise, the same reactions unfold, and the same sense of frustration lingers long after the moment has passed. It feels familiar, almost scripted, as if the outcome was decided before the conversation even began. This is how patterns of influence take shape, not through a single event, but through repetition. When someone knows your emotional responses, they don't need to change their approach often. They rely on what has worked before. The same phrases are used, the same topics are revisited, and the same tone appears at just the right moment. Over time, your mind begins to anticipate what is coming, and your body reacts before your thoughts can catch up. It becomes less about what is being said and more about what you have learned to feel in those situations. What makes repetition so powerful is that it conditions your reactions. Just like any habit formed over time, emotional responses can become automatic. You may find yourself getting defensive the moment a certain subject is mentioned, even if the situation does not fully justify it. Or you might withdraw completely, choosing silence as a way to avoid a reaction you have experienced too many times before. In both cases, the response is no longer entirely conscious. It is learned behavior shaped by repeated exposure. This creates a quiet imbalance. When one side understands the pattern and the other is caught inside it, control becomes uneven. The person who recognizes the cycle can guide it, intentionally or unintentionally, while the one reacting within it feels trapped by their own emotions. It doesn't always look like control from the outside. It often looks like normal conversation, normal disagreement, normal family interaction. But beneath the surface, there is a structure that keeps repeating itself, reinforcing the same emotional outcomes again and again. Over time, this repetition can affect how you see yourself. You may begin to label your reactions as part of your personality rather than the result of a pattern. You might think you are simply too sensitive, too quiet, or too reactive, without realizing that these responses have been shaped by specific situations repeated over time. This is where the pattern becomes deeply rooted, not just in behavior, but in identity. Breaking this cycle does not happen by changing others. It begins by recognizing the repetition itself. When you start to notice that certain situations follow a predictable emotional path, you create a moment of awareness. That awareness interrupts the automatic response. Instead of reacting instantly, you begin to pause. You observe the pattern as it unfolds, rather than becoming part of it without question. That pause is more powerful than it seems. It creates space between what happens and how you respond, and in that space, choice returns. You can choose not to engage in the same way. You can choose to remain calm where you were once reactive. You can choose to step back instead of stepping into the same emotional cycle again. Gradually, the pattern begins to lose its hold. What once felt automatic starts to feel optional, and when something becomes optional, it no longer controls you. The repetition that once shaped your reactions becomes something you can see clearly, understand fully, and most importantly, move beyond. There comes a point where everything begins to shift, not because the people around you have changed, but because you have started to see things differently. It is not a loud realization. It doesn't arrive with confrontation or dramatic moments. It begins quietly with a simple awareness that something is repeating, something is influencing you, and something within you no longer wants to respond the same way. This is the moment where awareness turns into strength. At first, this awareness can feel uncomfortable. You start noticing patterns you once ignored. You recognize how certain words affect you, how certain situations pull you into familiar emotional states, and how easily your reactions can be predicted. It can feel unsettling to realize that your responses have not always been entirely your own, that they have been shaped over time by repeated experiences. But this realization is not meant to weaken you. It is meant to return something to you that was always yours: control. Inner strength does not come from shutting people out or building walls around yourself. It comes from understanding your own emotional landscape so clearly that no one else can navigate it without your awareness. When you know what triggers you, what unsettles you, and what influences your thinking, you are no longer caught off guard by it. You begin to see emotions as signals rather than commands. They inform you, but they no longer control you. This is where boundaries begin to form, not as barriers, but as quiet decisions. You start choosing what you engage with and what you step away from. You begin to recognize when a conversation is leading toward a familiar pattern, and instead of following it automatically, you pause. Sometimes that pause is enough to change the entire direction of the moment. Other times, it leads you to step back completely, not out of fear, but out of clarity. With this clarity, your responses become intentional. You are no longer reacting to protect yourself from something you do not fully understand. You are responding from a place of awareness, where your emotions are acknowledged but not allowed to take control. This shift may not be immediately visible to others, but it is deeply felt within you. The same situations that once overwhelmed you begin to lose their intensity. The same words that once triggered strong reactions begin to sound different, almost distant. Over time, this changes the dynamic entirely. When your reactions are no longer predictable, the patterns that once relied on them begin to break. What used to feel like a cycle starts to feel like a choice. And when something becomes a choice, it loses its power over you. You are no longer moving within a structure shaped by repetition. You are creating your own direction, moment by moment. This does not mean everything becomes easy. There will still be moments where old reactions try to return, where familiar emotions rise unexpectedly. But the difference is that now you recognize them. You see them for what they are, echoes of past patterns, not instructions for your present behavior. And that recognition gives you the ability to respond differently, even if it takes time and practice. In the end, true strength is not about changing the people around you. It is about no longer being unconsciously shaped by them. It is about standing within your own awareness, where your emotions belong to you, your reactions are chosen, and your sense of self is no longer defined by patterns you did not create.